Former Foreign Affairs Minister Lloyd Axworthy says Canada should convince Poland and the Baltic states to stay in a treaty banning landmines. Mr. Axworthy helped the Ottawa Convention become a reality in 1999. But defense ministers in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia now say that they unanimously recommend withdrawing from the treaty. Mr. Axworthy says pulling out of the anti-landmine treaty would make the world less safe. Our news director, David Clement, has more on the push for some countries to abandon that treaty.
Thank you for that, Theresa. On the issue of landmines, it's important first to go back in time and discuss how the mine ban treaty came about. So the whole purpose of creating a treaty to discourage the use of landmines was specifically to address the humanitarian problems that would come after landmines were used in war. And so it's important to remember here that landmines are indiscriminate. Once they're placed in the ground, if something sets it off, that is what sets it off. There is no way to discern what is ultimately going to end up being impacted by the explosion. And so what we saw throughout kind of the history of their use in modern warfare was after wars in particular, landmines that were laid down would end up exploding after conflict and end up exploding in many instances because civilians didn't know that they were there, impacting farmers, children, you name it. And so it created a very, very problematic circumstance where landmines were used. And then after a war had taken place, they remained in the ground and caused a lot of problems for civilian populations. And so the landmine treaty, it went through a bunch of different processes historically over time. It was adopted in 1997 in Oslo. It was signed in Ottawa in 1997 and was enforced on March 1st, 1999. And so it was created or spearheaded in large part by Canada's Foreign Minister, Lloyd Axworthy. And the whole purpose, as I said, was to try and address that growing problem of landmines. Now, what makes this interesting in the context of the Baltic states and why they are seeking to remove themselves from the treaty is mostly geography. So it's mostly geography in the sense of whom these countries border. So if we move, looking at the Baltic Sea, if you start with Estonia, they share a particularly large border with Russia. And so naturally, Estonia and the Estonians would be concerned that potentially there could be some sort of future Russian invasion. How do they defend themselves against a Russian invasion? Well, landmines would be an option there because it allows for them to fortify the border in a way that makes it incredibly difficult for future Russian forces to cross the border into Estonia. The same can be said for Latvia. They share a border with Russia and with Belarus. And so Belarus obviously is not Russia. They've long been an ally of Russia and Putin. Russian forces have moved through Belarus during the war in Ukraine. And so it has been a throughway for Russian forces. So obviously for the Latvians, there would be growing concern there as well. Now, if we keep moving south on a map, you look at Lithuania. Lithuania doesn't share a border with what we traditionally understand as Russia. They share a fairly large border with Belarus, so the same concerns that the Latvians would have. But what they do share is a border with Kaliningrad, which is a small part of Russia directly on the Baltic Sea, which is completely blocked off by the borders of Poland and Lithuania. And so, hypothetically speaking, the concerns of the Lithuanians, beyond being Belarus being a through point for Russian forces, it would be Russian forces entering Lithuania via Kaliningrad. And that is also the same for Poland. So Poland shares that same border with Belarus, and then to their north, they share a border with Kaliningrad. And so the move here from these Baltic states to remove themselves from the mine ban treaty is essentially an effort to create fortifications on where they could potentially see weak points with weak points with regards to a future conflict with Russian forces. And the reason why, despite the fact that obviously they are indiscriminate, the reason why some of these countries may be looking at using landmines is that landmines operate and exist without personnel. And so you don't have to have the border actively armed with thousands and thousands and thousands of armed troops. You can use landmines as a means to essentially create that security against a potential invasion without having to devote the manpower to what are hundreds, if not thousands, of kilometer long borders, depending on the country we're looking at. And so it is a big step back in terms of the Ottawa Treaty to ban landmines, but the justification from the Baltic states ultimately comes down to how do they best secure their border with the growing concern and possible threat of Russian invasion. And so this seems to be part of the direction that they're taking in terms of ensuring their security and trying to hedge against any possible future conflict from Russia.